Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this joint event of the Center for the National Interest and Energy Innovation Reform Project, where I'm the president, to talk about great power competition in the technology sphere, and specifically a new technology Cold War, or a new technological Cold War. I think we have a terrific panel today. We will have George Beebe first, then Paul Heer, then Rob Atkinson. I'll introduce each of them before each person speaks. And when we open it up to questions, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen to type in questions, and I will sort through those and read them out. Otherwise, I will try to keep this very brief. Why don't we get started with our first speaker, George Beebe. George, of course, is Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest, a career intelligence analyst of Russia, and the head of the CIA's Russia analysis, also a former national security aide to then Vice President Cheney. George, take it away.
Great, thanks, Paul. So what I want to do is talk briefly about what went on in technology competition during the actual Cold War, and then talk a little bit about the ways the current great power technological competition differs from the good old days or bad old days, depending on your perspective. And I want to keep this relatively brief and focus on a few key points on all of this. The first point is that the technology competition between the United States and Soviet Union was fought both offensively and defensively. So by defensive, what I mean is there was a significant component of protecting American and Western technology. And we did this largely through mechanisms such as the COCOM, which was the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls. This was established early in the Cold War to provide Western nations with a forum to coordinate their policies to deny sensitive military and dual-use technology to the Soviet Union and its allies. This wasn't a formal treaty organization. It was basically a forum in which the West could discuss key issues in technology and take decisions by unanimous consent, essentially, and there were no real enforcement mechanisms. This was an area basically for coordinating, just as the title of the organization implies. This was largely appropriate because the Soviet bloc was pretty much a closed economic system. It was for the most part unintegrated into the broader world economy and trading system. Now, some levels of trade investment occurred from west to east and vice versa, but they were at relatively low levels and in fairly tightly controlled situations. So for the Soviet Union to get access to Western technology, the Soviets had to rely primarily not on technology transfers through trade and investment, but on espionage. So a lot of the protecting of American technology that went on outside control of that trade and investment took place in the world of intelligence. Now, the second part of this was offensive, and by that I mean developing American technology. And this really got a major shot in the arm with the launch of Sputnik, the Soviet satellite in 1957, which really sent a shockwave through American society, and people, had rather stark evidence that the Soviet Union was ahead of the United States, at least in the area of rocket and space technology. Although I think the reality was that had the United States really focused on putting a satellite into space first, we probably could have done so. But the Sputnik really sparked a major US government effort to fund research and development in military and security related areas, to invest in technology related education in fairly massive ways. And this paid off, I think, enormously over time, both in the area of military and space technology, but also in commercial applications to these technologies that paid big dividends. And I'll just note on the side that Silicon Valley, which we think of today as largely created by three guys in their garage, was in fact built on a foundation of defense industry that was the edifice on which a lot of the companies and technologies in the information technology domain that we look at today had their start. Point number two, and now I'm going to shift a little bit to how today's competition differs. Unlike during the Cold War, the Chinese and Russian economies today are not closed systems. They are not unintegrated into the broader economy. To greater or lesser degrees, both of these economies are largely dependent on exports. In the case of Russians, we're talking about energy and extractive industry exports. In the case of China, a lot of manufacturing exports based on cheap labor and outsourced supply chains. To varying degrees, both of these countries have sought this integration. They've sought to attract US and other foreign investment. And they have tried to gain better technological expertise through attracting Western investments and investing in technology companies abroad. This is a fundamental difference, I think, between what's going on today and what happened during the Cold War. And I would add, again, parenthetically, during the Cold War, there were never large numbers of Soviet students enrolled in American universities studying science and technology, gaining access to advanced Western intellectual capital. That's obviously not the case today with China, and even to a lesser degree, not the case with Russia. Third point, technology has changed the espionage game in very important ways. Back in the bad old bricks and mortar days, if the Soviets were trying to acquire sensitive technology, they really had to go after the US national security complex, the Pentagon, the intelligence community, that web of cleared government defense industry contractors that were working on classified systems. These were large organizations, not particularly easy to penetrate, and oftentimes the Soviets had to rely on human-based intelligence collection. Slow, high risk, took years to come to fruition. Today, the targets of that espionage have changed, and the way they attempt to gather this information has changed. So because so much high technology development in the US today is done through university or privately funded accelerators, the targets of this technology espionage are oftentimes startup companies, early stage tech companies. That's where a lot of the breakthroughs are coming, particularly in information technology. These don't require large organizations. They don't require a lot of government funding or involvement. And the takeaway from this is that if we're going to defend US technology, defend that intellectual capital that's being developed, you've got to do this through a joint public-private effort. And that's different than in the past. It makes this in some ways more formidable. Secondly, cyber espionage is low risk by comparison to using human beings that can be discovered, and you can get enormous amount of information relatively easily and relatively quickly. And moreover, the cyber offense has great advantages over the cyber defense, at least right now, which means if a skilled cyber spy really wants to gain access to a particular system, chances are pretty good he's going to be able to do that. Point four, the line between this espionage and old-fashioned warfare, actual kinetic conflict between states, has blurred significantly by comparison to the Cold War. And I'll briefly describe why that's the case. When a cyber spy penetrates an information system, he can get lots of data, as I just said. But while he's in that system, he can destroy or corrupt that data, and he can sabotage the workings of the system that he's penetrated that can cause important infrastructure like satellites and power plants and weapons control systems to malfunction. And the problem for the cyber defender is the defender can't know what the ultimate intentions of the intruder are immediately after a penetration is detected. So when you play cyber defense at high-tech organizations, you can't simply assume that the spies are there just to gain access to technology. You also have to worry that they're also there to sabotage the workings of that technology. And that means that the line that separates spying and warfare is by no means clear in the 21st century, which means we have a lot less strategic stability in all of that. One final point. Gathering and protecting data has become, I think, the biggest high stakes game in the modern technology competition world. Protecting data is a very tough challenge under the circumstances I've just described. And high tech has become much more globalized. It's no longer concentrated in just the United States and Europe. East Asia, other parts of Asia, Israel are becoming key hub centers, which means for people looking to steal technology, to gain that access to that technology, it's a lot more dispersed and a lot more difficult for the United States to protect. And then I'll make a couple other points that I think we'll want to explore more. I think the Chinese government, and to a lesser degree, the Russian government, have some big advantages when it comes to gaining and protecting data, which is really the name of the game right now. And we're going to have to figure out how we play that game more effectively under the difficult circumstances that we face today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, George. So now let's turn to Paul Heer. Paul's a distinguished fellow at the Center for the National Interest. Also, like George, a longtime intelligence analyst and including service as National Intelligence Officer for East Asia. So Paul, your thoughts?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. I guess what I've been asked to do is to complement George's remarks by bringing China into the equation more deeply and kind of introducing another plane to the debate to the discussion by comparing the US-Soviet competition to the present US-China competition. So I think what I'll do is basically just kind of briefly summarize in a few points what I see as the similarities and then some of the differences and where technology fits into the equation. In terms of the similarities, I mean, clearly in both cases, we have a strategic competition for power and influence in which both sides are trying to maximize their position relative to each other. I think this in both cases, as I mentioned in actually another seminar related to this last week, it's driven in part by structural rivalry between two large competing centers of power. There's an ideological component, obviously, and different views on the international structure. But I think that the differences are greater, certainly in this realm, compared to that. I mean, if the US-Soviet competition was defined as a Cold War, I don't think we're entering into a Cold War with the Chinese for a couple of reasons. China is simply not the same kind of challenge or threat that we faced from the Soviet Union, and we can't really deal with it in the same way. I mean, when George Kennan in 1947 introduced the concept, the doctrine, and the strategy of containment, he attributed the need for it to the Soviet leaders' belief in a basic antagonism between the capitalist and socialist worlds, which kind of obviated, in their view, the possibility of any, quoting from him, a sincere assumption of a community of aims between the two sides. I just don't think the Chinese leaders today subscribe to this absolutist winner-take-all strategy. So the ideological challenge is not really an existential one. And in fact, there's more to the point, there's no basic antagonism that I can see between capitalism and what the Chinese call socialism with Chinese characteristics, because socialism with Chinese characteristics incorporates a lot of capitalism. And frankly, I believe the Chinese are genuinely interested in the possibility, at least, of a community of aims between the United States on shared interests and international goals. But the two of the other reasons why I think it's different that are directly relevant, and more importantly relevant to the technology sector and the technology realm. The first is that the world is not divided into two camps aligned with Beijing and Washington, as it was during much of the Cold War. And it's unlikely, I think, to move in that direction, no matter how much we might want that to happen. And the other reason, and I think the most fundamental one for the purposes of this discussion, is the level of interdependence and integration between China and the United States. The containment of the Soviet Union was essentially based on the calculation that isolation of the largely autarkic Soviet system would eventually lead to its failure and its collapse. The big difference now is that China cannot be isolated from the international system, and it's certainly not autarkic. It is competing and is highly competitive across the board in ways that the Soviet Union never was. China is pursuing its global strategy through every measure and every element of national power. And I think that's especially the case in terms of the US-China competition today in the non-traditional security realms. And that's where technology and economic competition comes to the fore. In fact, I think that the economic and the S&T competition is the central thrust of China's strategy against the United States. And what does this mean? The implications of this for the technology sector, I think, some of these are self-evident. In fact, I think George mentioned a couple of things here, but, you know, I think as George, I think, alluded to, starting in the early part of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had an economic and an S&T system that was largely separated and insulated from the rest of the world. China obviously is fully integrated into the rest of the world, and particularly in its S&T sectors. And in fact, and I defer to the experts, and I know that Rob Atkinson can talk in more detail about this, the US and Chinese S&T sectors have advanced in large measure because of this integration. That's how technology works, through international collaboration, not through sequestration and decoupling. And I think this is the integration is reflected. I'm not sure how up to date my statistics are, but I mean, well, I'll obviate or ignore the statistics, but there's a very large number, a third or so, of American science and technology STEM grads and members of the US workforce that are Chinese. And China itself is producing STEM grads that are contributing to the international S&T sector in amazing numbers. If the US were to sever its ties with the Chinese in the science and technology realm, we would be isolating ourselves from what I'm told is the largest population of scientists, engineers, and mathematicians in the world. And as an aside, we're already kind of flirting with discouraging Chinese students in the United States from joining the US workforce, which is instead going to, well, the numbers that are increasingly going home to engage in the Chinese economy is increasing. This is going to affect US economic competitiveness because of this interdependence. And it's also going to reduce potentially our access, American access to science and technology collaboration at a time when other countries are coming around the bend and becoming more competitive against us. The second issue, I mentioned that the U.S. And the Cold War comparison, the world is not divided into two camps. This is certainly not the case in the S&T sector. I mean, given the competitiveness and the integration, the idea of decoupling the U.S. and Chinese S&T sectors is going to lead some. We should be careful what we wish for, if this is what we're wishing for, because some countries, because of their interdependence on China, are not necessarily going to choose our side if we divide the world into two different sectors. They're not necessarily going to follow our example by excluding themselves from collaboration with China. Many of them can't afford to. And we can't, most countries are going to want to continue to collaborate in the S&T sectors with both China and the United States because of the mutual advantages of the nature of technological competition internationally. And just as an aside also, we can't assume that we're going to be able to retain leadership of all the industrial standards that are one subset of this that I'm sure Rob can talk to. I guess my bottom line and my final point is really that, although there are, we define a lot of this in terms of national security risks, our interdependence or dependence on China and vulnerability to China. There are certainly national security risks to S&T cooperation with China, but there is a downside to that too. There is a national security risk, as I said, in some sectors, but withdrawal and decoupling would impose risks of its own. As I said, it's more export controls and visa restrictions, even when they're appropriate to a certain extent, but when they're based in some cases on exaggerated fears, it's going to diminish mutually beneficial collaboration and cooperation with allies. It risks the United States potentially being even more isolated than China. In fact, other countries, including our allies, are already taking steps to reduce their hedging their bets to reduce their dependence on U.S. Technology and equipment. And I think this ultimately, and this is my final thought, I think that there are ways to approach this which might be dangerous in terms of eroding the centrality of the United States in global S&T and in eroding the U.S. access to technologies that are developed either in China or in collaboration with China or through China's collaboration with other countries. So I think there's kind of a balance sheet we still need to work out. And at that point, I'll turn it over to Rob, who knows much more about the specifics of the technology sector than I do. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. So now we'll go to Rob Atkinson. Rob is the founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, has written extensively on technology, competition, and business issues. And I think across the last 4 administrations, if I'm not mistaken, has been on a variety of different government advisory boards and councils on technology-related issues, including some focused on U.S.-China. So Rob, please.
Thank you, Paul. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Looking forward to the questions later. So, I mean, one of the challenges is even when the term Cold War was first coined, it was never really a perfect term. We weren't at war. What was it? So it was a metaphor. And I think what we're looking for now is what's the right metaphor for thinking about China? Clearly, the metaphor we had before, which was China is moving to be a normal country that joins the WTO and will have moved towards sort of our values, both in terms of market and politics. That clearly is not the case. That clearly didn't work out the way we thought. So we're looking for another metaphor. I'm happy with Cold War II. I think it's a perfectly good metaphor. But to George's point, there are a lot of things that are different, and there's no question about that. We need to identify. But I think the advantage of using the term Cold War II is it makes it quite clear that China is an adversary. And I think one of the things I think that we have to recognize, Paul made this point about that with the Soviet Union, it was really a battle between one kind of overall system versus another, democratic capitalism versus authoritarian socialism. That clearly is not what's going on with China. I don't believe that's what's the challenge or competition is. But I do believe there's just as serious a competition. And I actually think that China is autarkic. They're autarkic when it comes to technology, advanced technology. When you look at their goals and their quantitative numbers that they've set out in plans like Made in China 2025 and the most recent Strategic and Emerging Industries Plan, you know, their ultimate goal is to be self-sufficient on many, many technologies. And you just have to go back and look at what they did with telecom equipment. They were 100% dependent upon imports in the 80s, and by 15 years, they were zero dependent on it. And then they, with Huawei and a whole set of unfair practices, moved to become globally dominant. And that, I use that term very specifically, that is their goal, global dominance. And they only were stopped in that quite recently. It was like, you know, it was like the Russians getting almost to Moscow, if you will, and then being pushed back. That was Huawei. They were almost to Moscow. So, you know, and we see that in the past. In 2000, the US had 55% of solar cell production. Today, we have 5%. China has 60%. Most of that was through unfair trade practices and technology practices. We see it in the futures technologies. Their goal is on semiconductors to displace the leading US semiconductors makers, both in memory and processors. We see it in biotech, where they're making enormous strides on essentially biotech drugs, large molecules, genomics, et cetera. We see it in aerospace with Comac. Their goal is to replace Boeing. So I see that as a major, major challenge. Clearly, that is a major challenge to our defense industrial base, because our defense industrial base is so critically dependent, as George pointed out, much more dependent now on commercial sector and commercial capabilities that we have. So I think that we do need to think, I actually don't think that our cooperation with China when it comes to technology on net, if you added it all up on the pros and cons, I think it works out to a significant con. And I wouldn't say that if China was playing by the rules, if they hadn't deeply manipulated their currency, if they didn't force tech transfer. I mean, the amount of US companies that are forced to give away their technology to Chinese partners in order to get market access is astounding. Their manipulation of their anti-monopoly law, which is essentially almost like a gangster-like tool where they go in and put a gun to your head to give you all these concessions. So I do think that's one thing that's different. If I could just go to a couple of slides, and I think the first slide, that would be great. This is from a report that my colleague David Moschella and I, David is with the Leading Edge Forum. We wrote a report recently on how we should think about China. And let's go to the first one, please. I think the first one, yeah, there we go. So if you think about it, we really, and this goes a little bit to Paul's point, we do have a lot of tight relationships with China where it's in our interest, but we also have tensions. And so at one level, China is the largest market for many, many firms. And in the Soviet era, that wasn't the case. You know, Starbucks, Procter and Gamble, you know, you name it. Many, many American companies sell an enormous amount in China, and that's critically important for our economy. China is also the biggest supplier. They supply oftentimes through American companies, but they supply an enormous amount of goods to the US that are important. They're also increasingly their toughest competitor. The Soviet Union was never a competitor. And then now, like the Soviet Union, they're our main geopolitical rival. So in the old Cold War, there was really only one of those that mattered, and that was main geopolitical rival. The Soviet Union didn't have any of the other three factors. So if you go to the next slide, please. So this suggests, if you think about it, that Western organizations have very different views. There are a lot of companies that want to sell to China and are keeping selling to China, and their advice, their pressure is, look, we're selling a lot to China, don't rock the boat, just keep everything stable. You have companies that are selling, or even Chinese or American companies that are selling back into the US, and they're saying, hey, we really rely on Chinese manufacturing. Think about Apple and the iPhone. If you want us to move some of that production out of China, it's going to take a long, long time. So don't rock the boat. On the other hand, you have a growing number of industries and companies that are over in the competitor side. And that's in part why I think some of the pressure against China has been growing. where, a number of U.S. firms have been, severely hurt by Chinese policies. I mean, look at Qualcomm. Qualcomm sells a lot to China, but Qualcomm was forced to pay a trumped up, I believe, a $900 million fine and reduce their licensing fees. Qualcomm still wants to sell to China, to be sure, but they also understand, as do many other companies, that there's unfair practices there. And then lastly, the other reason here, I think, for why we're seeing this is the state function, if you will, the governmental function of the U.S. that cares about the U.S. itself, has seen now that China is much more of a geopolitical rival. They're building up their military. They're using Belt and Road and other types of policies to gain global influence and advantage and control. So I think this makes this whole thing much more complex than the Soviet Union. And I'll agree with Paul that we shouldn't have sort of severe decoupling, and we shouldn't always be saying no. We should have Chinese students here, et cetera. But at the same time, we can't just be saying yes like we were 5 years ago. We've got to come up with a much more realistic way of dealing with the real serious challenges that China has, with the recognition that we're not going to force them into a sort of, cul-de-sac that the Soviet Union was in. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. So let's open it up now for questions. And again, I would encourage everybody to use this Q&A box down at the bottom. Perhaps first, as we're just getting a few questions here, I sensed a little bit perhaps of disagreement between Rob and Paul on China. Paul, would you perhaps like to take just a couple of minutes to respond to some of the things that Rob said?
Certainly, yeah. Actually, I feared more disagreement than became apparent to me the more he kept talking. Yeah, I particularly liked the second slide that you projected there, Rob, because I think it's consistent with the point that I was trying to make about the conflicting priorities. I think that these are just hard choices we have to make. And that was kind of the point I was trying to emphasize when I said that there are reasons to pursue, I guess, I mean, for one of a better term, some level of decoupling for national security and competitiveness reasons. But I mean, there are downsides, as your slide shows, to consideration, a lot of those things. And I think that just to reiterate, these are tough choices that are going to require kind of a cost-benefit analysis on both sides. With your point about China actually being autarkic in technology, I'll certainly defer to your expertise on how to characterize that. I think maybe there's a distinction between autarky and an effort to maximize their self-sufficiency. I think they certainly are trying to do the latter. Maybe I don't understand some of the different extrapolations of what autarky means. I think the Chinese realize that they can't be, but they're just trying to minimize their vulnerabilities. But the thought that occurred to me when you made that point was that Washington is kind of in the same boat. We can't be autarkic. We don't want to be. And I think that a lot of the issues that are being debated now are driven by our own desire to minimize our own vulnerability and the security with which we can control the sector ourselves. So I think I basically agree with most of your presentation. I guess depending on what we mean by autarky, I suppose, and how realistic that would be for China to pursue.
Let me perhaps, Rob, give you an opportunity if you'd like to respond directly to Paul there. And I know that George had a comment as well.
Yeah, so I think the Chinese motivation for what they've done has evolved somewhat. So if you go back to the 2006, what was called Medium and Long-Term Plan on Science and Technology, the MLP, that really was much more, you didn't see the language of sort of dependency and needing to get out from under the yoke of the West. It was much more about we're basically in labor cost, commodity production and manufacturing. We want to move up the value chain into more high tech and more value added and more advanced production. but still, and now their motivation is much more about, Paul, as you said, it's about, we don't want to be under the thumb of the US. They understand after what President Trump did that we can cut them off and do serious damage to them if we wanted to. And so they're really racing as fast as possible to not be dependent on us. But the policies really fundamentally haven't changed. They're still the same kinds of policies, which is to build up as fast as possible their advanced technology sectors across. I mean, the MLP had 200 plus sectors. Now, obviously, they're not all going to get the same priority, but their goal, in my opinion, is to become the globally dominant firms in semiconductors, in computing, in drones, in biotechnology, in aerospace, in high-speed rail, in robotics. I mean, you name it. You know, printing. They gave $3 billion to a Chinese company. Just gave them a check. A Chinese printer company that was was being sued by Lexmark and HP for IP violations, which they were clearly guilty of. They stole the IP to make printer heads. And then they gave them $3 billion and they bought Lexmark. And Lexmark was super happy because they got like a 30% price premium on their stock. When you read what the direction from the government was, we want you to go out and become a globally dominant printer company. So, you know, that's just one sector. So I think that's really what's behind that. And I think, you know, that's not Ricardian free trade. You know, the Japanese are good at lasers, but they import our jets kind of thing. You know, the Germans are good at machine tools, but they hopefully will import our Google or, you know, our IT and software. I don't see China doing that. I don't think they've read Ricardo.
George.
Yeah. A quick comment on this question of self-sufficiency. I agree that the Chinese have quite deliberately attempted to ensure that they have all that they need in order to be self-sufficient in all these technology areas. The United States has not. As a matter of fact, we've taken a quite different approach to all this, believing that outsourcing of a lot of things, a lot of supply chains, is a good thing. I think, you know, we very much have premised a lot of our approach on Adam Smith, comparative advantages, thinking that all of this works for the greater good, including for US national security. But I would argue that it is not a greater good for US national security when we are dependent on China for lithium supplies that in turn are critical to all kinds of high technologies that we must have. We're not better off if we're dependent on Chinese supplies for such simple things as medical equipment that we've discovered somewhat belatedly over the past half year in dealing with COVID. So we're going to have to think harder about the tension between self-sufficiency in some of these areas and comparative economic advantages and economic growth, because they are in tension to some degree on all of these things. We can't have it both ways. We're going to have to make some difficult choices.
Thank you, George. So I have 4 questions here in the Q&A that I'll start going through. We have a little bit more than 20 minutes, so I will try to encourage on the part of the panelists brief responses. Joseph Bosco has written for George, you note that China and Russia don't have to rely on espionage in the same way that the Soviets did because technology has become much more readily available for them. But they still spy, steal, and sabotage. Does that suggest that they are ideologically motivated and trying to defeat the West?
No, I don't think so. And if I implied that the Soviets were, you know, much more dependent on espionage than the Russians and Chinese, I did not mean that to say that espionage has lost its utility, it lost its importance to these countries in the 21st century. I think it remains very important for everyone. And espionage is not something that is generally driven by ideology, or to quote former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, by a country's peculiar genetic makeup. I think that espionage is something that states have engaged in for as long as there have been states, and they always will. And it's due to the nature of the international system. Espionage in many ways is not only become easier to do, a great source of information, of technology that can enhance states' national security and also enhance states' economic development. But it's also something that I think states have every incentive to engage in more, regardless of their ideology. The barriers to doing it are smaller. You don't require great, state-funded large organizations to be effective spies today. If you've got some, mathematically inclined folks, you can get access to things as a small country, or not even as a country, as a non-state actor that back in the old days you never could have gotten access to. So I don't think this is really tied to ideology at all. There are all kinds of incentives for states to engage in this activity, regardless of their ideological makeup. And the fact that the United States is doing all of this, as I think we all understand, underscores my point. This is not driven by the internal character of a regime.
Could I respond to that, Paul?
Oh, sure, Rob, please.
So to me, a couple of things that are important there. I mean, George pointed out that the Soviets engaged in espionage, and I know that because I've watched the Americans on TV, so I learned all about that. But they did that, but everybody kind of knew the Soviets were bad actors and were acting in bad faith, and we had shut them out of the sort of the global economy. What I think is different is China has been led into the global economy, into the WTO, into the community of nations, and they're still doing this, and they're doing it much worse than I think the Russians ever did. And that's very different. I mean, there's one thing to let the Russians, we didn't let the Russians, but we pushed back against it. It's another thing for a country that claims to be playing by the rules, claims to want to be part of the community of nations, and is unreconstructed IP theft country. And I think we have to recognize that and say, you can't have it both ways. You want to be part of the community, you have to ramp down your theft. And I guess, George, I've never been in the intelligence community, so maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that the US turns over commercial secrets to Intel or Oracle. We spy for our own national security and state interests, but China spies for its a good example of that when Nortel went out of business in 2008, they sold their building to the Canadian Defense Department, and the Canadian Defense Department, of course, before they occupied the building, they went in with their electronics guys and they did all this search, and they found that the building was riddled with listening devices. And they also found out that those listening devices were sending information over to Shenzhen. I don't think the US government does that. So I think that's a big difference.
Thanks very much. So we have a couple of questions here that I will bundle together because I think they're substantively related. One is also from Joseph Bosco, and this is for you, Paul. Isn't the world, in fact, moving toward a confrontation between two ideologically based camps? Aren't the countries in the Indo-Pacific and Europe, starting to form groups on that basis? Isn't that a direction that the world is already going? Then Daniel Atkinson of Cato is asking, and I think it's kind of a related question, if the US and China are in a race for technological preeminence, and a number of these technologies give very important first mover advantages, doesn't that make it much harder actually to contain this competition and to prevent it from becoming really a full-fledged Cold War? So maybe, Paul, we'll start first with you on Joe's question, and if you have anything brief on the second one, and George and Rob, if you'd like to also kind of chime in on this question of, is Cold War and new global division sort of inevitable or not?
Okay, I'll
Paul.
start.
Yeah, please.
Sure.
And
Actually,
we have two more. I'm sorry, we have two more questions, so I want to be sure we keep it moving.
Okay, I'll try to be brief then on Joe Bosco's question. Hello, Joe. Good to hear from you. I think there is, as I acknowledged, an ideological component to the competition, and I think that's reflected in there is a emerging coalition of U.S., Indo-Pacific, and European criticism of China on human rights issues. I think that reflects that. I guess my point is, and I think this is where it dovetails with George's comments, I think that's a legitimate element of the competition, but I don't think it's a winner-take-all contest. And I think there are, I don't know if I'd want to call them countervailing trends, but other priorities and considerations that kind of compartmentalize the values part of the equation, because a lot of the other partners that agree with us in terms of China's ideological, repugnance in a sense, have other more material and strategic considerations that make them resistant or reluctant to join in a purely ideological crusade against China. So I think that's part of the tension that we have between competing priorities. And I think it limits the potential for really an anti-China coalition or a containment because of the non-ideological components of the competition. On Dan Eikinson's question, I think it flows into the same thought. I think it is hard to contain the contest as long as both sides believe that they're engaged in a winner-take-all contest. I think this is one of the things, the elements of the competition that I see problematic is the perceived need for preeminence. I think it's not realistic for either side of this contest to believe that they can achieve and sustain preeminence across the board into perpetuity. I think that's one of the things that makes the competition so difficult. That we're going to, I think, probably end up sharing preeminence in different sectors across the time and find a way to work with and around that.
Thank you, Paul. George, it looks like you have a comment.
Yeah, quick comment on this. I think the point about containing this and the difficulty of containing this, I fully subscribe to. And it's not just the advantages that accrue to first movers on a lot of this. It's also, as I pointed out earlier in my remarks, the fact that this competition blurs across lines. It's hard to separate economic competition from geopolitical competition from decisive advantages in warfare, for example, since so much of warfare these days is driven by information and data dominance. So the ability to acquire and protect data is so intimately related not just to economic competition, but to actual military competition, military conflict, that it becomes harder to contain this than it has in the past. And the Chinese, to get back to this earlier point of why did they differ from the United States in some of all of this? Yeah, they differ in part because they're willing to share intellectual property that they've acquired through espionage with key companies, key Chinese-owned companies, which gives them unfair advantages in all of this. But also, they're willing to impose quite draconian requirements on their own companies and on foreign companies to make their data available to the Chinese government. And they're also willing to put up barriers abroad to getting access to that data, which really puts the United States and the West at a severe disadvantage in this game of acquiring and protecting data. All of this makes this different than the Cold War. I think it makes this very dangerous and difficult to contain.
Rob, any comment on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Paul said. That and George, this is, we're not going to be in a binary yes/no relationship, or hopefully we won't be with China. But that doesn't mean we should be seduced by sort of false cooperation, which is what the Chinese want to do. And I think the biggest risk there is frankly on climate. You hear this over and over again. We need China to help us solve climate. And therefore, the implication is we should give up on some of our other strategic goals with China. The answer is we don't need China to solve climate. Why don't they solve climate? They have more people than we do. And we're not going to solve climate anyway without big innovation. So it doesn't really matter whether China gets rid of its coal plants or not. So I really worry that we're going to sort of give up a lot of our interests for some sort of, global goal that we don't really have to do. But the second thing is, I think if we had a national innovation strategy, George alluded to the fact that we had one after Sputnik. I have a new piece coming out shortly for the DoD journal Prism, where it argues that we had the greatest national innovation system known in history after the Cold War, from essentially 46 to 65. U.S. government was investing more in R&D than every other country and business outside the U.S. combined. Silicon Valley was the most defense-dependent county in the country in 1992. We've let that slide. We've let it wither away. And it's really time for us to, if we had a really robust national tech strategy around dual use, commercialized and defense technologies, there would be a lot less fear, a lot less pressure to sort of go after China in a hard way, because we could stay ahead on our own in an organic way. And without that, I fear we're going to fall behind and then get fearful and have to really sort of go to more decoupling, which I think could be a problem.
Thank you, Rob. So we have two more questions, which I think I will also bundle together because there's a certain logical connection. And then I'll throw in a question of my own, and perhaps we can just get responses from each of you and wrap up. So Jane Nakano at Center for Strategic International Studies is asking, which do you think poses the greater threat to U.S. leadership on nuclear energy? And perhaps we can start with you on that one, Rob. Russia or China? And should we consider active S&T cooperation with one of those two to try to contain the other? Then Paul Schwartz at Center for Naval Analyses is asking sort of a related question. How does the growing Russia-China strategic partnership factor into the U.S.-China economic and S&T competition? So this is looking at a different leg of that triangle. And I'm just going to throw in one more here. We've mentioned during the course of the discussion a few times our allies. But to the extent that any of you have any thoughts on our relations with our allies in this context, I think it would also be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, because our allies, as I think some of you have noted, kind of on one hand are our allies and partners and share many of our objectives, but on another hand, first of all, they have their own economic and technical and other interests. But secondly, actually, they're also our competitors in some of these technology areas too. So if I could ask each of you perhaps briefly for thoughts on that, perhaps Rob, starting with you this time, since Jane's question on nuclear, I think may be best for you.
Sure. So I really probably can't answer that question very well. David Hart leads our clean energy work and has been involved in nuclear and probably could answer that. So feel free to email David. I think the short answer is either one can beat us, because we don't really have a very sophisticated or strong nuclear energy policy in this country. I mean, we've sort of let it slide. Even the UK is better at SMRs than we are, for example. They have a robust SMR program. So anyway, we could do more and we should do more there. On Paul, your question, I agree with that. We're in competition or another, but I think ultimately you see this in Germany, where the German big business association is increasingly concerned with unfair competition from China. You see France really deal with that. You see now Boris Johnson in the UK. More and more, Australia, more and more countries are realizing the predatory economic nature of Chinese policies. And so I think if we play our cards right and don't alienate them and don't sort of put tariffs on their products, we could and should build a stronger alliance. I've talked to a number of officials in different governments recently about their interest in having some kind of more formalized technology policy cooperation with the US. The Canadians are interested, the Aussies, the UK in particular, the Japanese. So I think we should go down that path. I think there are areas where we could cooperate more effectively.
Thank you, Rob. Perhaps, Paul, we could turn to you next, and then George, I'll let you go last.
Yes, thank you. Actually, there's some very interesting elements of the kind of triangular relationship between the US, China, and Russia that are inherent in both Jane's and Paul's questions. I think on whether we could actually use S&T to drive a wedge between them, I think that will be very difficult. I think presumably the primary target would be an effort to draw the Russians away from the Chinese in this regard. But I'm not sure that we're in a position to offer anything to the Russians that would, that they couldn't get from the Chinese, and that would outweigh the other reasons that the Russians have, and I certainly defer to George on this, for cooperating with the Chinese. We're actually, I think, at risk of giving them more excuses to strengthen their relationship than to divide it. And I think that in terms of S&T, well, I guess I'll defer on the technology side, but on the general economic side, Russia is clearly the junior partner in the weaker leg of the triangle in terms of what it can bring to the table. So I think that there's limited potential for us to try to erode that relationship by pursuing competition within this sector.
George?
Yeah, just a quick comment on that. I agree with Paul. The potential for us to actually drive wedges between Russia and China right now, I think, is slight. What we need to focus on is not trying to drive a wedge, but to reduce the incentives for accelerated partnership, deeper integration, deeper cooperation against US interests than what we have done. And I think we've not kept our eyes on that ball over the past few decades. We've gotten surprised by how quickly Russia and China have cooperated with one another and the depth of that cooperation against us. And we've, I think, inadvertently encouraged this sort of thing without thinking too deeply about the results of the policies that we were pursuing. Now, there is, I think, a significant degree of technology cooperation between the Russians and Chinese, something we haven't paid a lot of attention to and should. And the indicator that I would point to in this is the number of jointly authored scientific studies that Russian and Chinese scientists are publishing. It's gone up quite dramatically. And I would say that this is probably an indication that technological and scientific cooperation in areas that are too sensitive for publication is probably going on too. And that's something that is not in the US interest to encourage, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, George, and really thank you to all of you. I commend you all for answering all of those questions and also hitting our target here on time. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to George and the center staff for organizing this event. I think it was a great discussion. This is the first in a series of several meetings, and I hope that everyone who's listening in will be able to join us for the rest of those. And thank you also, of course, to Center President Dimitri Symes for his willingness to collaborate in this exercise. So thank you all, and I wish you all the best. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.